Somewhere on the Pontic steppe, between the Black Sea and the Caspian, 5,000 years before the first Roman emperor was born, a population of nomadic herders lived in wagons and buried their dead beneath earthen mounds. They left no cities, no temples, no written records, nothing that would tell you, from the outside, that they were about to rewrite the biology of half the world. Their DNA is in you right now. For most of human history, we did not know who they were. I first came across the Yamnaya while researching something else entirely, a question about why Northern Europeans develop multiple sclerosis at twice the rate of Southern Europeans. The genetic trail led me somewhere I did not expect, not to a recent mutation, not to a dietary quirk, but to a population of steppe pastoralists from the early Bronze Age, whose immune adaptations have been sitting inside the cells of Northern Europeans for 5,000 years. What followed from that discovery was not a simple answer. It was an investigation that kept opening deeper rooms. What follows will trace three things: the genetic impossibility of the Yamnaya's own origin, which nobody anticipated, the mechanism by which a single population rewrote the biology of a continent in under 1,000 years, and the finding that connects the bones in those ancient burial mounds to your own living immune system. Start with the simplest version of the problem. For more than 2 centuries, linguists had known that something extraordinary connected the languages of the world: Sanskrit and Latin, Greek and Persian, English and Hindi. The structural similarities were too precise to be coincidence. The same root words for father, for mother, for water, for fire, appearing across thousands of miles of separation. Linguists eventually agreed on a name for the language they all descended from: Proto-Indo-European, a tongue spoken somewhere by someone thousands of years ago that fragmented and spread until its daughters became the native languages of roughly half the planet. What they could not agree on was where it came from or who spoke it. 2 competing theories took shape and spent decades fighting to a draw. The first, called the Anatolian hypothesis, proposed that Indo-Europeans spread slowly outward from farming communities in what is now Turkey, beginning around 9,000 years ago, carried by Neolithic farmers as they expanded into Europe. The second, the steppe hypothesis, argued that the source was later and further east, nomadic pastoralists from the grasslands of Ukraine and Russia, moving in the early Bronze Age. Both theories had linguistic and archaeological evidence on their side. Neither had a way to settle the argument definitively. Then archaeologists kept finding the same thing in the ground, over and over, from the Danube to the Altai Mountains on the Chinese border. A burial style, bodies laid in pit graves, covered in red ochre, buried beneath large earthen mounds called kurgans. The practice appeared too suddenly and spread too widely to be explained by slow cultural diffusion. Someone was moving fast, and moving far. But the bones in the kurgans could tell you what these people did. They could not tell you who they were or where they had originally come from. Archaeology had reached the edge of what it could answer. The material evidence pointed toward a major population event somewhere in the early Bronze Age, without being able to identify its source. For decades, the debate remained exactly that, a question that returned without resolution, an answer that kept retreating behind the limit of the available tools. Then the age of ancient DNA arrived, and everything changed direction at once. In 2015, 2 studies were published simultaneously in Nature that changed the terms of the debate permanently. The first, led by Wolfgang Hack and David Reich at Harvard University's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, analyzed genome-wide data from 94 ancient Europeans across a span of thousands of years. The second, led by Morten Allentoft and a team from across Europe and the Americas, analyzed 101 ancient genomes drawn from Bronze Age cultures across Eurasia. Both studies were designed to settle the language origin question. What they found went considerably further. This was an ancient DNA breakthrough. The expectation was gradual change, migration of ideas rather than people, the kind of slow, demographic diffusion that leaves traces but not dramatic discontinuities. What the data showed was the opposite. The late Neolithic corded war people of Germany, a culture archaeologists had considered fundamentally European in origin, traced approximately 75% of their ancestry directly to the Yamnaya steppe pastoralists. Not as a gradual accumulation. Within a few centuries of Yamnaya expansion into Europe, this ancestry was ubiquitous across Central and Northern Europe. The steppe ancestry, as the Hawk study noted, persisted in all sampled Central Europeans until at least 3,000 years ago, and is present throughout modern European populations today. The detail that stopped researchers was not the percentage, it was the Y chromosome, the haplogroup G2A, nearly universal among the early Neolithic farmers who had inhabited Europe for thousands of years before the Yamnaya arrived, almost completely disappeared from the European gene pool during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. It was replaced by haplogroups R1A and R1b, both characteristic of steppe populations. The male lineage of early European farmers was effectively overwritten, not blended, replaced. Here is what that means in numbers. The Yamnaya contribution to modern Eastern European populations ranges from 46.8% among Russians to 42.8% in Ukrainians. Northern and Central Europeans today carry roughly 30 to 50% Yamnaya-related ancestry, depending on the region. The migration that produced these numbers moved at a speed at least twice as fast as the earlier Neolithic farmer expansion from Anatolia. It was the fastest major population movement recorded in European prehistory. But the Yamnaya themselves, who were they? Where did they actually come from? Because that question, when researchers looked at it directly, turned out to have an answer stranger than anything the steppe hypothesis had predicted. The Yamnaya were not an ancient population of the Pontic steppe. They were new. Not new as in recently arrived from somewhere else, new as in recently created, the biological product of a fusion event that had never happened before in that part of the world. Genetic analysis identified two entirely separate ancestral lineages inside the Yamnaya genome in roughly equal proportions. The first was Eastern European hunter-gatherers, people who had lived on the European steppe since the end of the last ice age, genetically distinct and geographically separated from populations to their south for thousands of years. The second was Caucasus hunter-gatherers, a completely different lineage from the mountain regions south of the Caucasus, related to ancient hunter-gatherers from Iran and the Near East. These two populations had been divided by geography and time. Then, beginning around 5000 BC, centuries before the Yamnaya's great expansion, they came together on the eastern Pontic Caspian steppe and produced something that had not previously existed, a genuinely new population, carrying the genetic heritage of two worlds that had never before combined. The 2022 Southern Arc study was 3 papers published simultaneously as the cover story of Science. It was led by Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna and by Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich at Harvard, drawing on DNA from 727 individuals from the Copper and Bronze Ages. The study added a detail that deepened the strangeness considerably. Despite the Yamnaya expanding westward into Britain, eastward into China, and southward into South Asia, they did not continue south into Anatolia. The peninsula that lay directly to their south, accessible through the same geographic corridors their ancestors had used to enter the steppe, remained largely genetically untouched by Yamnaya expansion, right down to the time of the Roman and Byzantine empires. A population expansion that reached across 6,000 kilometers of Eurasia somehow stopped at one specific boundary. Lead geneticist Iosif Lazaridis put the scope of the expansion plainly. The Yamnaya are at the root of all populations that speak Indo-European languages today, with individuals belonging to this population scattered all the way from Hungary in the west to western China in the east. That sentence, taken at its full meaning, encompasses the ancestry of billions of living people. English speakers, Hindi speakers, Russian speakers, Persian speakers, Greek speakers, a line that runs from a steppe between two seas to every language you and I are using right now. Pull back from the genetic detail for a moment and consider what it actually means. Modern Europeans are, in the most literal genetic sense, the product of three successive population layers, laid down across thousands of years. The first were the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the original inhabitants of the continent after the last ice age. The second were the Anatolian farmers, who arrived during the Neolithic and transformed the genetic landscape of Europe, replacing much of what had been there before. The third, arriving last, moving fastest, and leaving the deepest mark, were the Yamnaya. Some have argued that a population movement this complete and this rapid must have required extraordinary violence, a continental conquest, a systematic elimination of what existed before. The data complicates that picture. Analysis by Anja Furtwängler's team at the University of Tübingen found that in some regions, Yamnaya ancestry was present for over 1,000 years before it fully dominated the local female lineage. They identified female individuals without any detectable steppe-related ancestry up to 1,000 years after that ancestry first arrived nearby. The demographic transformation was not a single sudden event. It was prolonged, complex, and it operated differently across different parts of the continent. The steppe did not just carry people, it carried biology that is still operating inside living humans today. The 2024 study led by Professor Eske Willerslev at the Universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen was the world's largest ancient human gene bank. It included nearly 5,000 ancient genomes and 175 researchers, and it was published in Nature. That study traced the elevated multiple sclerosis risk in Northern Europeans directly to genetic variants carried by the Yamnaya herders approximately 5,000 years ago. Those variants were almost certainly protective at the time, bolstering the immune response against pathogens carried by the Yamnaya's cattle and sheep. In Denmark, which the Yamnaya replaced rapidly and thoroughly, multiple sclerosis rates are among the highest in Europe. In Sardinia, which received almost no steppe ancestry, multiple sclerosis rates are among the lowest. The north to south gradient in multiple sclerosis prevalence is, in a measurable biological sense, a Yamnaya gradient. The same ancestry reached South Asia through later steppe expansions. Steppe-related admixture in modern South Asians ranges from 6.5% to over 50%, depending on region and community, with the highest concentrations found among Brahmin groups, the traditional keepers of Sanskrit, the oldest documented branch of the Indo-European language family. Here's the thing that stays with me after spending time inside this research. What stays with me is not the scale, it is the origin. The Yamnaya were not conquerors who emerged from an ancient settled homeland. They were themselves the product of two completely separate peoples, lineages that had been divided for thousands of years, finding each other on an empty grassland and becoming something new, a fusion that had never happened before. And within a few generations of that fusion, they were moving across a continent at a speed that prehistoric Europe had never seen. Not because they built great walls or great institutions, because they had wagons, horses, and a mobile economy that could sustain movement across distances that farming communities could not match. When you speak English or Hindi or Russian or Spanish, you are participating in something that began on that steppe 5,000 years ago. The structure of the language carrying these words traces back to that fusion event. So do the immune variants in Northern European cells that the 2024 Willerslev study has now connected, directly and specifically, to the Yamnaya migration. The Yamnaya dissolved into every population they entered and became something new, as migrations always do. But they did not disappear. They persist in the structure of every language descended from theirs, in genes, in elevated disease risks, in the living cells of billions of people who have never heard their name. The steppe is empty now. The kurgans are still there.